You want to see a role playing game that would really cheese off the Satanic Panic people back in the 80s? Stick around and we'll talk about the Palladium Fantasy role playing game tonight on the Old Dragoon. Hey, welcome back to the Old Dragoon. For those of you that noticed there was a little bit of a gap between the Indiana Jones video and this one, it's because I attended North Texas RPG Con a couple of weeks ago and kind of got a little bit behind. So, NTRPG Con is an event I like to think of as Gary Con South. And the reason I say that is because we have a lot of original creators and original writers and artists that attend the convention every year. It's where I met Frank Menser and Larry Elmore, which really made my day because, as you all know, the BECME D&D is where I started. And I've since gotten to play with a lot of wonderful creators, and it's a great con. So, back to what we're doing tonight. We're going to talk about the Palladium Fantasy role-playing game, or as it was called originally, the Palladium role-playing game. Rumor has it that this was Kevin Simbita's attempt to do D&D better than D&D, do it the way he would do it himself, and fix some of the things that stood out to him as needin' fixin'. So let's take a look at what he came up with. We're going to be looking at the revised edition, and in a moment you'll see the revised cover, and we'll page through and see how it's similar to D&D and how it's different. This was among the first role-playing games I ever played. One of my friends introduced me to it when I was in the 8th grade, and I sort of fell in love with it. Partially because it used the same system as the Robotech RPG, which, as people that are fans of the channel will recall, was my first RPG that I paid for out of my own money. So I was already familiar with the Robotech system, so Palladium Fantasy came naturally. And it also had some rules and features that I was really fond of when I was younger. And I guess when we get to them, we'll discuss whether or not I'm still fond of them. So let's dig into the book. This is the cover that the Palladium Fantasy role-playing game was printed with towards the end of the first edition era. I have a couple of copies of this. I do have a couple of copies of the older cover. And I even have the pre-revised edition, which has some insanity tables that would not be looked upon fondly these days. So, diving in. This is the version that you can get on DriveThru RPG. It is, in fact, still available, and I prefer it to the second edition, and we'll discuss why when we get there. So, we immediately get the how to play, which really isn't as much of a how to play as we got in, say, the BECME Player's book. We do get a definition for a lot of the terminology used in the Palladium game, but not really as much of a example of play as I think we may have needed. When you create a player character in this game, you're going to have 8 attributes rather than the 6 of Dungeons & Dragons. Those attributes are IQ, which is exactly what it sounds like on the tin. Mental endurance, which you can think of as sort of a willpower and ability to resist mental effects. Mental affinity, which is the personality part of what D&D rolls into charisma. Physical strength. Physical prowess, which is more or less the dexterity ability score. Physical endurance, which is more or less constitution. Physical beauty, which is the appearance side of D&D's charisma. And speed, which is the flat-out ability to move across the ground with your legs. So to determine the attributes, you'll roll 3d6 most of the time, and I'm sure that sounds very familiar to everyone out there. But rather than giving different species or races plus or minus to that 3d6 die roll, Palladium gives them outright different numbers of dice to roll. There's also an interesting mechanic in which if you roll towards the top of the curve, you will get to roll an extra die. What is considered top of the curve depends on how many dice you're rolling. With 3 dice, I believe you are looking for 16 or greater. No, 17 or 18. My bad. And then if you are rolling only 2 dice, if you roll a natural 12, then you get another die roll to add to that. If you're rolling more dice than that, you don't ever get exceptional attributes. Each of these attributes will give you a bonus if they are over a certain threshold, but there are really no penalties for having a low stat. The Palladium system didn't really see that until, I believe, Rift's Ultimate Edition, where popular demand ended up with a rule being added as an optional thing for negative penalties for low stats. But more or less, aside from the things that had a direct effect, say physical endurance on hit points, rather than this being a bonus to your hit die like Con in D&D, physical endurance plus a d6 is your starting hit points. So physical endurance stat is very important to your initial hit point total. But other than that, if your scores were between, say, 3 or even 2 for some of the races that roll 2 dice for things, and about 15, then the stats were kind of mechanically the same. Now, roleplay and good GMing would mitigate this, but as far as the actual rules were concerned, there was really not a whole lot of bonuses and penalties until you hit what was considered the high end. Whoops. So the bonus chart starts at 16. So 15 and below, you're really not going to see a mechanical difference except in a couple of cases. One being physical endurance, which we've already discussed, and the other being speed, because your speed multiplied by certain amounts, depending on race, will tell you how far you can move during a melee round. So that does have a direct effect, but as far as bonuses and penalties to other rolls, not so much. When your IQ is high, you get a percentage bonus to all your skills. And this is all your skills, even the ones that would seem to be more, say, physical prowess based, like prowl or pickpockets. So if the skill has a percentage score to roll against, IQ will add to it. Mental endurance adds to your saving throws for both psionic attacks and insanity. Mental affinity will give you a percentage chance to cause an NPC to trust you or to intimidate that NPC. Physical strength is a straight out bonus to damage, not to hit. Physical prowess gives you a bonus to parry and dodge, and parrying is definitely a thing in this game, and a bonus to strike. Physical endurance gives you bonuses to your saving throws against coma and against magic. And physical beauty gives you the outright ability to charm and impress. This is sort of like the comeliness edition of Unearthed Arcana to D&D. We have the list of attribute charts, which includes the lifespan of the different races available and how common it is for them to be cannibals. I find that an interesting addition. Certainly that could come up in roleplay. So for the races, you also get their average height, whether or not they have night vision, whether or not they have a propensity for psychic powers, psionics, and if they are limited in which classes they can play. Just like old school D&D, certain races could not be certain classes, and humanity was the one that was wide open. Elves are also wide open, along with Wolven, Changelings, and Ogres, interestingly enough. So, I love this piece of artwork, by the way. There are quite a few more starting races than there were in old school versions of D&D. Modern D&D, there are various species and ancestries, coming out the waz. But, we used to just have elf, dwarf, halfling, occasionally gnome, and then maybe things that were introduced in source books or in splat books. Palladium came out of the gate with quite a few races. As you can see here, the list is troglodyte, human, troll, ogre, orc, dwarf, elf, gnome, kobold, wolfen, changeling, and then hobgoblin and goblin. The races are outlined with different languages. And then, strangely, we jump straight into an explanation of game mechanics. So you choose your race, you roll your dice, and then you stop for a minute to learn how the game works. Palladium books have always had a strange organizational paradigm. So, hit points begin at your physical endurance plus a d6. This happens no matter what class you are, so everyone is sort of on an even keel with hit points starting out. Every time you gain a level, you gain a d6 hit points. Every class. So, hit point recovery happens naturally, and unlike, say, the Beckme rulebook, which forgot to say how much natural healing takes place, you find out here in Palladium that, natural hit points come back at 2 per day when you're initially resting, and then 4 per day once you've rested for a couple of days. Now, some Palladium games have an additional resource on top of hit points called SDC. That is absent in this version of Palladium Fantasy. It's added in the second edition. So we're not going to really talk about it except to point out its absence in the beginning of the game. Almost every other Palladium game has SDC. Robotech, Rifts, Beyond the Supernatural. It's sort of a reserve of toughness that you can take a pounding before you start taking life-threatening damage. I found that to be sort of an unsatisfying addition to Palladium Fantasy 2nd Edition because it drug combat out longer. I understand why they did it for compatibility with their other games. But in fantasy, I kind of like to see combat go a little faster. So, yeah, I'm glad there was no SDC in this version. So, surviving coma and death is largely a matter of percentage saving throws. There's an optional rule for reducing attributes permanently if you survive severe damage, and possibly picking up insanities. So there are optional tables you can roll on to see how many kids were in your family, how much your character weighs, how old they are at the start. Where are you from? Did you have a particular background before you became whatever class it is you're going to choose? And even sort of your personalities and dispositions. Most players want to pick this sort of thing, but new players or players that are just looking to play something new or something different might use these random tables. They're also great for creating NPCs. The insanity tables are pretty detailed and tend to be used when you fail mental saving throws or sometimes when you take great physical damage. As a kid, I scoffed at this, but having survived open heart surgery and a 5 times bypass, I can tell you that going through something like that does have definite mental effects. So, Kevin, if I said anything wrong about this back when I was a kid, I apologize. The insanity tables here have been revised. In the original insanity tables, things like homosexuality were listed on the table as an insanity, and that was removed for reasons because society has changed. 98% of us no longer look on things like that as an insanity or a mental defect. Thank God. And so, those things have changed. But the insanity tables are here. You can do a really good horror game. In fact, there's a horror factor rule that we'll see later that allows you to really do dark Cthulhu-esque sort of things if you want to. You can also grab Beyond the Supernatural and borrow lots of monsters from that if you really want to have like a dark fantasy world. More insanities. There's actually rules for alcoholism as well. Now we get into alignments, and this is very interesting to me. During the time that this came out, we were still talking about the standard D&D alignments, either lawful, neutral, chaotic in the basic D&D line, or the 9 alignment system with the law and chaos axis cross-referenced with the good and evil axis. Kevin Simbita writes in this section his personal belief that there's no such thing as neutral, like true neutral. He doesn't believe that characters can be true neutral. So what he's got are 2 good alignments, along with a list of activities or actions that someone with that particular alignment will or will not take. So you really get a better idea of what the alignment means in the game world. The selfish alignments replace neutrality. For almost every book I've seen, the unprincipled alignment is described as Han Solo, the guy who's out for himself. The anarchist alignment, slightly different set of morals on the list, but also not necessarily evil. The evil alignments are, by definition, evil. If you can take a look at some of the things that they say they will or will not do, and they're pretty execrable, except for Aberrant. This is an alignment that caught my attention a long, long time ago, and I have played many characters with this alignment when I was young because, hey, edgy teenager. The Aberrant alignment has apparently never seen the recent Dungeons & Dragons movie because it says there is no honor among thieves. The Aberrant alignment is the honorable bad guy. This would be like Britai in Robotech or Destro in G.I. Joe. They definitely have a code they live by, but it would not be recognized as a righteous code by anyone of a good or even selfish alignment. I can say I had a lot of fun playing those characters, and it was pretty neat, you know, being somebody like Destro or the way I imagined Warduke to be. Experience points in this game are very different than they are in D&D. You explicitly get XP for many things besides killing enemies. And you don't necessarily have to kill the enemy to get the XP for it. You can subdue the enemy or simply overcome the enemy and get those points. You can get points for coming up with plans that save the group or save other people. Like if you want to do a Magnificent Seven kind of story and save a village, you can get lots of XP for that. Clever thinking gets XP. Even using your standard skills will build up a little bit of experience points. But you will find that if you run it by the book, leveling up is a lot less common than it is in most versions of Dungeons & Dragons. It happens less often, takes much longer to climb into the higher levels. In fact, the Palladium role-playing game only goes to level 15. So here's where we get the classes, which are called OCCs, or Occupational Character Classes. They're broken up between Men of Arms, which is exactly what it says on the tin, all the fighter types, Men of Magic, the Clergy, and then there's some optional OCCs that I actually like to throw in there, like Squire, Scholar, Merchant, even Noble. You could play a straight up noble person who does not have an otherwise adventuresome class. There are requirements for each of the classes for how high your ability scores or attributes need to be to qualify for that class. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Mercenary fighters need at least a strength of 7. Some of them are a little more difficult. Paladin is hard to qualify for in Palladium Fantasy. It requires no less than 5 minimums. 4 minimums. 10, 10, 12, 12. You can sort of multi-class, but not in the same way we did in Dungeons & Dragons. You advance to a certain point in one class, then you stop, and you advance in another class. Your first class's abilities stay exactly as they were and will never again go up unless you switch back at some point. You can never simultaneously raise multiple OCCs. You've got to be doing one at a time. Initial equipment is laid out. It'll save you the shopping trips because there's lists of things that each type of character simply comes with. And one of the things I do like is if you create a soldier character who is by definition enlisted in someone's army, they get gear handed to them by the army, but they are also obligated to continue serving that army for a certain period of time. However you get out of that is up to your role play. Or maybe the game master even uses that as a springboard to bring the character group into certain adventures. There's a list of skills that are broken up between elective skills and secondary skills. Most of these will have a percentage chance of success, and you'll just roll D% equal to or lower to succeed. Some, like weapon proficiencies, will be handled a little differently by bonuses during combat. And in other versions of Palladium, including the second edition of this game, you have physical skills that will add to your SDC, add to your strength, or your physical prowess. Those things are largely absent here, but they do show up in almost all the other Palladium games. In the later Palladium games, you will also find the hand-to-hand combat skills broken down usually into basic, expert, martial arts, and later games added commando and assassin. Those were the choices you had in, say, Robotech or Rifts, but the Palladium Fantasy RPG First Edition has a separate hand-to-hand combat skill for each of the man-at-arms classes. They all have a different progression of combat bonuses, and therefore they all have a distinct fighting style. I really liked that, and it is one of the changes I disliked most in Palladium Fantasy 2nd Edition. I think it took some of the flavor out of the game. You will be given skills based on your OCC, and then you will be given skill choices that you can use to pick the skills you want to customize your character. Primary skills are usually limited to a certain list. Secondary skills can be more open, but may also be limited. Once you pick those skills, you get them at the beginning percentage, give or take an IQ bonus. So there's explanations of the skills, what they are and how they work. Here are the hand-to-hand combat skills so that I can give you an idea of what they actually do. So each of these has a separate set of what bonuses you get per level. So a first level soldier will have a damage bonus. So will the first level mercenary. But the knight will get a higher damage bonus, as will the paladin. Those are paid for by larger experience point requirements to level up. When we get to second level, we start to see a little more variety. While the soldier picks up a second attack per round, the mercenary picks up a defensive bonus to parry and dodge. They don't actually get their second attack until third level. The knight and the paladin both pick up extra attacks per round, but at third level, the knight lands more damage, while the paladin gets a defense bonus. The longbowman, meanwhile, gets a dodge bonus at first level because they are focusing on the use of their bow. You'll see there's also a hand-to-hand non-men-at-arms OCC. This is the catch-all for any OCC that is not directly trained in frontline combat. This would be like sort of basic self-defense for characters that aren't frontline fighters. It is usually picked up by almost every other character just so that they'll have something they can use in melee combat. There's Assassin, Ranger, and Thief. We see the horsemanship skills at the bottom, and note that there's a difference between knightly horsemanship and general horsemanship. Paladins have a separate horsemanship skill as well. And then here's a bunch of these skill progressions. Now, something they do smooth out a little bit in the second edition and in almost all later Palladium games. In fact, I think it is absolutely all later Palladium games. You get a base skill and then a plus per level, rather than the tables you see here. It takes up a lot less space. Now, that could use some additional refining so that you don't have to look up, okay, cooking gets plus 8% per level, but this other skill over here gets plus 2%, and this one gets plus 5. Smooth it out, Palladium, if you ever do revise your system. This is for the weapon proficiencies. It's a lot like the hand-to-hand proficiencies, and these bonuses stack. If you have a bonus to damage, or to parry, or to strike from your hand-to-hand skill, you will stack it with the weapon proficiency bonuses. Missile weapons get a rate of fire based on the weapon proficiency. The longbow will eventually gain 9 attacks per round. This overrides the hand-to-hand attacks of the user, who will normally have hand-to-hand longbowman or hand-to-hand ranger. The short bow can also deliver the staggering rate of fire. The sling can come up with 10 shots per round, but of course the sling will have shorter range and do less damage. The secondary skills tend to be utility skills. They tend to be lores, skills you'll use in camp, things like that. They have their own set of percentages. And then we go into the OCC descriptions. This is kind of my favorite part of the book, reading what all the different classes can do. So we'll take a close look at the mercenary fighter so that you see what the format is for a class. You have the title of the class, the attribute requirements, in this case, a simple physical strength of 7. The OCC skills are the skills you get automatically. In this case, the hand-to-hand skill associated with mercenary fighter, a proficiency in small shields, and the skill scale walls with a 10% bonus. Most of the time, skills that are handed to an OCC as part of their basic training might have some sort of bonus. You get to choose 6 other skills from the main skill list. Then you get to choose 8 skills from the secondary skill list. You will gain varying numbers of skills at different levels, so you'll have a choice later to pick up some more skills. Then you see we have a list of the elective skills that are allowed to the mercenary fighter, and bonuses, if any. Not every skill gets a bonus, but some do. Then there's a list of secondary skills. You can choose any secondary skill, but you're given a list of the ones the mercenary fighter is simply better at and gets a bonus. You also get a look at the mercenary fighter's XP table. So moving through the men-at-arms classes. The soldier has an explanation of how much money a soldier makes for doing the soldiering. It gives you an idea of officers and specialists, but it doesn't really say how you reach that. And I like that. A lot of games from this era, from the 70s and 80s, that had some sort of a rank system would tie it to level. And that can be difficult to adjudicate. One of the great examples is the second edition of Starships and Spacemen, which uses more or less the D&D BX rules. Now, this is a more modern game, but it's based on the original Starships and Spacemen. It assigns a rank title to every level. The problem is, if your party is leveling at a generally even rate, which they tend to do, then everyone in your space military is going to be about the same rank, And you'll end up with the problem the original series Star Trek crew had once they got into the feature films, is you got 3 captains and everybody else is a full commander. It's a little strange. But they leave that to role-playing in this case and list how much money that they make. You get some free equipment in exchange for your service, and an explanation of what kind of armors that the soldier tends to wear. The soldier has slightly more stringent requirements and gets to pick 1 more elective skill, but 1 less secondary. So they're a little more focused on their job and have a little less free time. But they also require more XP to level up. You'll see this a lot in Palladium games. All classes are not created equal. All hand-to-hand skills are not created equal. The balance is supposed to be found in the speed with which the classes level up. The Longbowman is one of the only 2 OCCs that can actually use the longbow. The other is the Ranger. And you see the Longbowman doesn't get a scale walls. They just get hand-to-hand Longbowman and WP Longbow. They also require more XP than the other 2 classes we've seen. The Knight comes with a explicit listing of the Code of Chivalry, and you are expected to follow it in your roleplay. The Knight is given the knightly hand-to-hand skill, knightly horsemanship, proficiency in large shields, and lance automatically. Right off the bat, you see the Knight gets more OCC skills. They get 7 elective skills and 8 secondaries, and a fairly high, so far, XP total to level up. The Paladin is not the Paladin of D&D and does not have any sort of divine magical ability. It's simply a knight taken to the next level, the upper crust of knighthood. So the Paladin is sort of a knight writ large. The Paladin gets more secondary skills. The Paladin gets the ability to read and write. Literacy is not assumed, along with the other skills the knights get. The Paladin has access to Paladin horsemanship and Paladin hand-to-hand, and is all around just slightly more capable than the Knight, but it also has more stringent requirements to be a Paladin. The Ranger has a couple of outdoor skills as automatic skills with huge bonuses, 22% and 20%. That's Identify Tracks and Track. You get 8 elective skills and 10 secondary skills. The Ranger is a very, very skillful class. A lot of the lores and outdoor skills like identifying plants and trapping and skinning animals, all that sort of thing is the bread and butter of the Ranger. And the Ranger requires less XP than either the Knight or the Paladin, but also tends to be slightly less capable of heavy combat. Rangers can wear any armor they want, but they are more comfortable in lighter armors. The Thief comes with an explanation of how guilds work and how fencing stolen equipment works. I find that pretty cool, because you really didn't get guidance like that in some of the early D&D books. You spend a couple of pages learning how fencing and guilds work. And you get the rates for hiring thieves and assassins. The Thief only defaults with its hand-to-hand skill and scaling walls. It gets 7 elective skills, more than a couple of the classes we've seen, less than the high-level ones. 7 secondary skills. And they have some pretty good bonuses at the things you would assume a thief would be good at. Prowl is the move silently skill for Palladium. Picking locks, picking pockets. But the interesting thing here is that all of those skills are elective. They're not simply assumed. So unlike D&D of the era, You're not going to have all the thieves having the same skill set, and if you're playing basic D&D or first edition AD&D, having the same numbers, give or take a dex bonus in AD&D's case. Thieves also level up relatively quickly. The assassin is sort of a variation on thief. Assassins can actually make use of heavy armor on the regular if they're not trying to be sneaky, which is kind of neat. They have less elective skills than the other classes, with only 4. But they get 4 weapon proficiencies. So effectively they have 8 elective skills, but 4 of them have to be weapon proficiencies. They require almost as much XP to level up as the knightly classes. And you'll see that the optional classes are very short, very straightforward. None of them have special abilities as such, so there's no explanation of special abilities associated with these classes. Squire, you would expect, will eventually multi-class into the OCC Knight or perhaps the OCC Paladin later on. The Scholar can be useful to have around if you need a Sage. The Merchant might be a character that runs the inevitable caravan that low-level characters are usually hired to protect. And of course, the Noble could be surrounded by adventurer types and bring them with them on some sort of quest, maybe to find the mansion of a cadet branch of the family that hasn't been contacted in decades or something to that effect. It can be fun to play any of these kinds of characters as long as you understand you are not going to be as combat capable and you're not going to be using magic. Here we get an explanation of how melee combat and missile combat works before we even get to the rest of the classes. Again, the organization in this book is not what you'd expect, but I'm sure it makes a certain amount of sense in that, okay, here's the fighting classes, now let's learn how to fight. Everything's done with a D20 as far as attacks, defenses, and initiative. Initiative is rolled every round. So unlike modern versions of D&D where you make an initiative roll and that initiative stands for the rest of combat, every 15-second melee round, initiative is re-rolled, which means things could swing wildly this way and that. It's similar to AD&D and D&D Basic in that initiative is continually rolled throughout the battle. That sort of stopped with 3rd edition. So you still see that in AD&D 2nd edition and in the variations on Basic that continue through the mid-1990s. So, damage. You actually see SDC mentioned here because while the characters do not have SDC like they do in other Palladium games, your armor does. This is one of the rules I really liked when I was younger, and now that I'm older, I'm not so sure I would be as fond of it. And that is that your armor takes damage and becomes less effective as it is damaged, and then you need to repair it. As a kid, I really had a simulationist mindset, and I wanted the game to simulate some sort of reality. So the fact that your armor wears out, rather than the assumption in, say, a basic D&D game where the fighter buys plate mail as soon as they can and will never change out that armor unless they find some magic armor. In this game, you actually have to pay attention to the condition your armor is in and either buy some new armor or repair the armor. So that's why SDC is mentioned under damage. Attacks per melee, unlike the more modern interpretation of the Palladium rules where you get quote-unquote 2 attacks for living, characters started with 1 attack per melee round, unless their hand-to-hand gives them 2 at first level. So magic attacks are listed as how they take place in the melee round. And just like most versions of D&D, being in hand-to-hand combat is bad news for casters. You roll a d20 and add your strike bonuses to strike. With a 5 or greater, you've earned a hit. So there's a 75% chance you're going to land a blow. The opponent may try to parry the blow. Now, this will eat your melee attack if you are not trained for automatic parry, but all the Men-at-Arms classes are trained for it. So they get to roll a d20, add their parry bonuses, and if they equal or exceed the attacker's roll, bang, you blocked the incoming shot. You can try to dodge instead of parry. That does take an action. Auto dodge is something that you see in other Palladium games, and it's usually a pretty rare ability. You can choose to attack simultaneously rather than attempting to defend yourself. This leaves the opponent open, but chances are both people involved are going to take damage. So bonuses from attributes, your strength is going to help you land extra damage. Your physical prowess is going to give you a bonus to strike. Now later on, when firearms are introduced, you find that physical prowess does not apply to those. But in this version of Palladium Fantasy, it applies to all attacks. For some reason, saving throws are dropped in here. Some saving throws are going to happen during combat, but several of them aren't. So I'm not quite sure why they were organized this way. You have to hunt to find what your base saves are. And as you see here, everyone's base saves are the same. You simply add bonuses or penalties granted by your attributes, or less commonly, your OCC. So we get to the explanation of armor. Armor has an armor rating. It's usually going to be above 5, because 5 is the bare minimum you need in order to hit at all. The armor has an SDC capacity. That's how many points of damage, and an SDC and a hit point are the exact same thing. So if you have a D6 short sword and you slam somebody in the armor, they'll take the same D6 damage that the person inside the armor will take. Once the SDC of the armor is depleted, the armor is no longer effective. If the armor is brought down to half its original SDC, it drops its armor rating by 2 points. When you're down to a third, it drops by 2 more. So armor becomes less effective really quickly. I think nowadays I would find this a little fiddly to track. But again, when I was a kid, I loved quote-unquote realism. Some creatures have a natural armor rating. And what's interesting about that is if you roll under the armor rating, there is no armor for you to damage. The attack simply does nothing. Here's the list of armors. So cloth armor does have an AR of 5 and only 6 SDC. That means it only helps you if somebody rolls exactly the minimum number needed to hit. Additional armors have higher armor ratings, more SDC, but they're also heavier. So again, old school, we're tracking how much weight our characters are carrying. Full suits and half suits are a thing. Barding for horses is also a thing. And here comes the wonderful list of weapons. There certainly are a lot of them. And while some of them do damage that you would expect in a Dungeons & Dragons game, Some of them do significantly more damage than most D&D weapons do. Notorious among these is on the second page. The Flamberge, 3 to 18 damage. It's a really big two-handed sword with a Chris-style blade that's got... and now the word escapes me. I want to say crenellations, but that's a castle term. I can't remember what the term for a blade is. But you can see the little illustration there. There are all sorts of different weapons. And a bullwhip is actually effective in this game. In a lot of games, a whip does like 1 to 2 damage. Here in Palladium, it does 1 to 8. So Indiana Jones is pretty welcome in the Palladium world. A whip-wielding character like, say, Zorro would also be able to do pretty well here. Now, here's something cool. Long before masterwork was a thing in Dungeons & Dragons, Palladium had introduced rules for bonuses to weapons that were not magical in nature. And both dwarves and kobolds could achieve this for a price. You could have effects added to a weapon as it was forged that add straight up bonuses, just like in D&D your magic weapons would. But the bonuses tend to be higher in this version of the game. You know, in D&D a +3 sword is a pretty rare thing. And here you can easily go up to +4 or +5 on things if you've got the money to make it happen. Armor can also be enhanced, but it does way more than standard armor. You can add plenty of SDC to the armor, but it's going to add a lot of weight. There's a huge equipment list. Like, lots of stuff. Much beefier than the short lists that appear in BX and BECME. And then, all of a sudden, we're on to how magic works, and the magical OCCs. You see, the Wizard OCC is listed right next to the heading for spell magic. That is because as they explain how the wizard works in the Palladium world, they're also explaining how spell magic works integrated together. What you will find is you'll have a certain number of spells per day, but you do not have spell slots in the D&D sense in that you can only cast spells of a certain level. In fact, a first level wizard can actually cast legendary spells. They'll simply have a much lesser effect because a first level wizard's casting them. If you manage to find one of those legendary spells, sure, you can toss it. It's just not going to last as long or do as much as a more experienced wizard. This gives you a lot of flexibility, and I really like it. On the other hand, this is one of the first places in the book that you will find things that will make certain players a little uncomfortable. The way to gain spells, one of the common knowledge spells, if you're not going to buy spells and you're not going to find spells on ancient books, you can always use the Enchanted Cauldron. There is an explanation of exactly how the Enchanted Cauldron spell works, and it requires 6 pints of fresh human blood. As you can probably guess, this would be really disturbing to the Satanic Panic crowd back in the day. When I had to debate someone, an adult at my church, and I was all of 14 years old, over whether or not role-playing games were satanic in nature, I brought my Dungeons & Dragons books to use as examples. I did not bring my Palladium book. What am I, stupid? So, you can see that, yeah, the Enchanted Cauldron, that's going to be a little bit of a weird spell. You're commuting with spirits. You need human blood to do it. It can kind of drive you insane. It's the kind of thing that TSR during the mid to late 80s would be avoiding like the plague to try to avoid any more bad press. Palladium just dove in there. Priests of relatively high level can sell spell magic. Even though they can't cast spell magic themselves, they can sell it to aspiring wizards. Again, spells can be traded, they can be given, you can convert scrolls into your spell book. There's a fun table of bad things that can happen if you do this poorly. And also a table for unstable spells, which I believe predates the mentions of wild magic in Dragon Magazine. There's an explanation of how scrolls work. And then we start to get into something D&D didn't explicitly have at this time. Circles, wards, runes, entirely different types of magic that are used by different magic OCCs and give you a lot more variety than the wizard-cleric dichotomy or the wizard-cleric illusionist in AD&D. And you'll see what some of these can do. So there's a listing of what wizards can and can't do in combat. They could actually put on heavy armor if they wanted to, but it would really restrict their movement. They can pick up and use any weapon they want to pick up and use, but they're probably not going to be proficient in a lot of them. There's a listing of how magical combat works. It's very similar to hand-to-hand combat and often takes place simultaneously with it. You just have a different set of bonuses. So finally, we get to the explanation of the Wizard OCC. What can it do and what are my requirements? Well, you need an IQ of 10. The Wizards picks up abilities like spellcasting, magic combat, scroll conversion. They know 4 common power words. They know the 6 common knowledge spells that every wizard begins with. And they get 2 extra languages and literacy. Note that the power words are actually listed here. It's not simply, hey, you know 4 power words. You know Akba, Charon, Pain, and Yin. Palladium gets detailed in this stuff. For magic combat, you begin with the ability to recognize enchantments. And you start out with 2 spells per day and only an 8% chance of successfully converting a scroll. Remember, there is that table of what happens if you do it poorly. So you might want to wait until you've gained a couple levels. You get 6 elective skills and 8 secondary skills. And here's the list of which ones you get bonuses on. There are some electives that men of arms cannot take. They're listed here. Recognizing runes, studying circles, studying symbols, and studying wards. Now this allows the wizard to understand and recognize these forms of magic. But these forms of magic are limited to the classes that utilize them. Interestingly, the wizard requires less XP to level than many of the men-at-arms classes, which is something that will be very different to a Dungeons & Dragons player, where magic user at the time was the highest requirement for leveling up, unless you're looking at the basic elf or the Unearthed Arcana Barbarian. We get into spell descriptions. You'll note that there's a listing of elemental spells. There is an entire class devoted to elemental magic, but wizards do have access to a subset of those elemental spells. So we're not going to read all of the spell descriptions, But you will note that most of the spell descriptions have effects per level of the spellcaster. This is because, again, the wizard can cast any level spell, no matter what their character level is. That'll just have a greater or lesser effect depending on that level. So at the top of the listing of magic spells, which does go to 11, although there are very few spells at the upper levels, there is a list of spells of legend. The spells of legend are ridiculously powerful spells that are supposed to come from the old ones. And they do pretty amazing things, like anti-magic or a magical barrier that'll stop almost anything. The next class is the Warlock. Warlock, in this particular case, means elemental magic. It requires a higher IQ than the Wizard and a high mental endurance. If you have those, you can actually become a Warlock of 2 elements. But most Warlocks will only master 1. And you have to pick it at first level, and that is your element. Warlocks are granted their elemental spell list by an elemental deity, so the GM can determine which particular spells are available to the Warlock. Warlocks have an interesting ability to speak to and deal with elementals. And if all other things are equal, an elemental will refuse to harm a Warlock. That could come in useful. Warlocks know the elemental power words, and again, the actual words are listed here. They know some magical symbols. They pick up additional languages. They only get 6 elective skills, but they do still get 8 secondary skills. And their bonuses are pretty thin. Although 2 of them are significant, the dowsing bonus and the read-write bonus, they don't get a lot of bonuses to a lot of the elective skills. They do get some pretty good bonuses to the secondaries, especially the lores. You can see here that Warlocks have a spell progression similar to, but a little bit higher than Wizards. But if they choose to split their focus between 2 elements, they have to split the spells that they use between those elements. There's a huge list of elemental spells. Some of these are a whole lot of fun. When we discovered the stone ships from Book 3, Adventure on the High Seas, we realized that a warlock aboard a ship that was able to manipulate earth could repair the ship by turning the stone to mud, forming it back over the damage, and then turning it back into stone. Also, a warlock that can control wind is really useful to sailing vessels. So Witch, this is the class that caused the most eyebrows to raise when I was a kid, because it explicitly says you draw your power from devils and demons. That was a big no-no back in the 80s. That was just proving Pat Robertson and all the other televangelists right. And I am not sure if Kevin Simbita did this to thumb his nose at those people, or if he just included it because that was a traditional witch from certain lores. So there's different pacts you can choose. minor pacts which will eventually be revoked, and greater pacts which absolutely hose your character at some point. Again, all of this tends to make some players really uncomfortable. You get the Devil's Mark, like an extra nipple. You can pick up a familiar. You get the ability to summon lesser demons and devils. Again, you know. And then there are different special abilities you can get, like controlling undead. And you can see they got cute with the experience point totals, all of which end in 666. This has got to be intentional trolling. So witches get a low number of elective skills, only 5, and a low number of secondary skills, only 6. But they are granted a fair amount of spell power. And of course, all the other things that come with the particular pact they make. The Diabolist, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with devils. The Diabolist uses very specific magics. In this case, runes. The Diabolist can use runes and wards to basically make a magical programming language. And you can affix the wards to things to make them do something. Now, just like all the power words are spelled out, you actually get a picture of all the runes. You also get pictures of all the wards. And then explanations of how you actually use the wards. And like I said, they're sort of like a programming language. Like if you put down protect and inflict, it will cause damage to anyone that violates the object protected. You get a listing of how long it takes to make the wards and then affix them. You can prepare wards ahead of time and then affix them in place on the fly. Mystic symbols, a lot of which are drawn from real-world legends. And you can see that they can only activate a certain number of wards at a time. That's their limitation. They can understand circles, but they can't cast circle magic. That's left for another OCC. Only 4 elective skills, only 6 secondary skills. The Summoner. Now this is the class that uses circle magic. And, you know, here's another picture that might not go over well with a certain crowd. All the circles are illustrated. And even left unsealed. I think fans of Supernatural might be amused by this. Completing the last circle at the end of the lower right line would make the circle considered sealed. And that would be the moment of casting the circle. And the circle would take effect. Circles can be used to summon as well as protect. And here's a listing of the power circles. So the Summoner gets 5 elective skills and 6 secondary. Their XP is comparable to that of a knight or a paladin. But circle magic, while it does root you to one spot, can be extremely powerful. The Mind Mage is how they throw psionics into the game. There are lesser and greater Mind Mages. And they pick up psionic abilities that are powered by inner strength points, or ISP. They actually get a decent number of skills, 7 elective and 10 secondary. But their XP is up there with paladins. We have a whole listing of psionic abilities. As you can probably tell, there's a whole lot more magic and spells than you find in, well, obviously basic D&D, but even more than in the Advanced Player's Handbook. This piece of art was always kind of amusing. Although, with the handgun, I wonder why it was included in the fantasy book. Alchemist is an NPC class, but it shows that magic shops, places to buy magic, are things that happen in the Palladium world. You can buy all sorts of magic, including magical armor. Even simple things like an indelible color. My armor is blue. To more powerful effects, like the Thunder Hammer, or a cloak of armor. Holy weapons, which are ridiculously spendy. But all of these are available for a price, in gold pieces. If you can find an alchemist willing to sell it to you, you can buy it. This is a little bit different from how magic items tended to be found in D&D. And in a lot of Dungeons & Dragons worlds, depending on the dungeon master, there are no magic shops. It's just not a thing. Magic is much more rare, much more special. In Palladium, magic is everywhere, and it's available for some coin. We finally get to the clergy. And there's a lot of play in the clergy OCCs. There really isn't an explicit class that is like the D&D cleric, except that there can be. And what I mean by that is that none of the priest classes automatically come with martial abilities, but they can if the deity they worship grants those skills, grants those abilities. So you can have a priest that is exactly that, a priest that will probably wear robes, maybe carry a staff, or you can use the different classes to build yourself a cleric style character, and even pick up the hand-to-hand non-men of arms skill, or in some cases, a deity will grant hand-to-hand mercenary fighter or hand-to-hand soldier. So you can build a D&D style cleric. It's just not the default. You also get some straight up abilities, like removing curses, the ability to resurrect, the ability to exorcise demons. The healing touch is very interesting, because once you hit 2nd level and gain the healing touch ability, it restores a D8 worth of hit points on a touch. You can do it once every other combat round, but there's no explicit limitation on how many times you can use it on a given character, other than you can't heal yourself. So, given enough time, a 2nd level or greater priest can bring the whole party back to full health if the DM decides to go by the book. I tended to put a little bit of a limitation on this in my games because it just seemed way too powerful. Undead turning does happen in this game. They tend to call it the dead. There are various prayers that are separate from divine magic. And it lists how you can add weapons and combat electives to your priest class to create something more of a fighting priest. So you have to have a decent IQ. You get 6 each elective and secondary skills. Your XP curve is actually more than that of the wizard. And that's appropriate, given all of the things that the priest can do. I find it interesting that there is no XP adjustment if the priest happens to be of an order that does use weapons, wear armor, and get trained in combat. You're going to advance at the same rate as a priest that does not. So dark priests can use curse as a class ability. They also have some slightly different prayers. The Priest of Darkness have very similar skills and abilities, and the same basic experience point progression. The Druid. This was a class that I loved to hate. The D&D Druid is the Druid that I more or less grew up with. This class sounds like it would be awesome because you get what we would in modern D&D called wild shape. You can transform into your animal totem, and that's really, really cool. Except for one thing. While you are in animal form, there is a chance you can get stuck there. There is also a chance you will be unable to return to your regular form. And a chance that you will completely forget who you are. And looking at this table, that chance is fairly high. Oh, sorry, wrong table. This is the right table. That chance is fairly high at low levels. Higher if you choose a carnivorous, basically more combat capable creature. So at low levels, you're really discouraged from using your ability to metamorphose into an animal. Druids don't really like to wear armor. They can only pick up the non-men-at-arms combat skill. If they do use weapons, they don't like metal ones. You need a slightly higher IQ than the classes we've seen so far in the clergy. You do need a high physical endurance. You have a good spread of skills, 7 elective and 8 secondary. And pretty close XP charts to the straight up priest. The shaman represents another type of preacher entirely. This is the tribal priest. Shaman get a separate set of abilities, including visions, and shaman are more capable to pick up combat skills. Unless you're a priest with a specifically combat-oriented deity. The healer is an interesting proposition. This is a psionic healer that has a lot more than just the plain old healing touch the priest has. But because this is a psychic class, you have a limited pool of inner strength points that you have to use each time you use one of your abilities. Your healing touch costs you 8 ISP. Your base ISP is twice your physical endurance. So say you have an average endurance of 10 to 12. Double that to 24. 3 healing touches and you're done for the day. But you do have a much wider variety of effects. So the healer can be an interesting class to play. It has a reasonable experience point spread. And you pick up 6 elective skills and 8 secondary. We have a listing of the religions in the Palladium fantasy world. Some of the deities are taken from real-world mythology. The old ones are sort of the Lovecraftian, preternatural deities. There's a listing of various different types of religion, and then we get into specific religions, where they're practiced, who they revere, and any basic notes. So, we move on. The gods have hit points. Just like in deities and demigods, the gods are assigned stats. And if they are assigned stats, inevitably your players might try to kill one. But they're there. The various deities made up. Some of the Egyptian pantheon ends up in here. And a thinly veiled Norse pantheon. Lots of gods and demigods. And then we get into demons and devils. You know, again, blah. And unlike Type 4 and Type 5 demons in old school AD&D, you get specific kinds of demon. Their habitats and their habits. Lots of demons and devils. Note that vampire was listed under demon. Lots. And yeah, we hadn't even hit devils yet. Which are distinct from demons in this game world. Now we get actual background text on the various races. The Wolfen are an interesting race because they are basically bipedal wolves, but they're also a very Romanesque empire. I love the source books that cover the Wolfen. Elves and dwarves, gnomes, and then we get into the species that we don't normally see in D&D, like troglodytes. Kobolds, which are not related to D&D kobolds at all. These are a very different type of creature. goblins, hobgoblins, orcs, all playable races in this game, and not necessarily believed to be consistently 100% evil. Changelings, which is a cool idea, you can morph into different forms, but you're also hated and feared. Ogres, trolls, and then we get into the bestiary, which is not as beefy as I'd like it to be. There's listings of dragons and dragon abilities. It's a little bit different because it's not just a straight up this color dragon, that color dragon, the other color dragon. They organize their dragons differently. Stats for elementals. Stats for angels. Information about fairies. Fairy food and drink gets expanded on. I believe it's in Adventure on the High Seas, but it may be in Book 2, the old ones. But there is some hilarious listings of fairy food and what it does. Stats for fairies, leprechauns, brownies, sprites. We get to magical creatures like minotaurs and unicorns. Listings of giants. Straight up animals. I know you really don't need a huge listing or even artwork for animals that exist in the real world, but it would have been kind of nice. Of course, this book is chock full of stuff. There is a map of the Palladium Fantasy world. I hear a lot of praise for this world in different message boards. I always liked this world. I loved the source books that explained the world. They had lots of fiddly things like maps of individual towns and individual cities. It may not be as popular or well known as, say, the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk, but it's worth a look. You really don't get a deep dive into the Palladium world in this book, but you get a slight overview. And boy, are there source books. Not as many as, say, Rifts, but there's quite a few. I love that you get pictures of the currency, get an idea of what the money you're stealing looks like. I like that Wolfen coins can be strung on necklaces and things to keep them together. The fact that the Wolfen just seem more organized than the other races. This is an adventure module, so we're not going to pay a lot of attention to it because I don't want to give it away for people that might want to play it. But I will say this. Some of the most interesting and unique magic items that I have ever seen are in that adventure. You get an index. And of course, advertisements for other Palladium games. And we're done. So how does it play? I find that the Palladium role-playing game plays similar to Dungeons & Dragons, but combat tends to take a little longer but be a lot more detailed. Players have a feeling of satisfaction in that it's more than just roll to hit my armor class and I take damage. When they're able to actively roll a d20 to parry, yes, that adds a step and slows down combat, but it makes the players feel like they are actively participating in their own defense in the way a simple armor class doesn't. The many and varied types of magic are really immersive. And by immersive, I also refer to the fact that you've got the listing of magical words. You've got artwork of the circles and the runes and the symbols. So you could actually use those things on props or require that the summoner speak the proper power words when casting. That may be going a little too far for some people, but you could do it, and it would add to the immersion of the game. I know that in playing in the Dragonlance world, I made notes of some of the spells that Raceland spoke in the novels and made sure that I used those when I was casting the spells in D&D. So the Palladium magic system does give you a whole lot to play with to immerse players in the world. It is sometimes difficult for summoners and diabolists to really integrate with the party when it comes down to combat. But their knowledge and abilities come in extremely useful while you're exploring ruins and dungeons, or even just making camp. If you find an out-of-the-way room in a dungeon that still has an intact door, the diabolist can throw some wards on it to warn you if something's trying to come through the door, or even to damage the thing that's trying to come through the door if it's not any of your characters. All of those new types of spellcaster can make things very interesting. The fact that there is no straight up fighter. There's a mercenary fighter, and then there's a soldier. And then there's a longbowman. All of those would probably be covered under the fighter heading in D&D, but they're all very different characters by the time they have some levels under their belts, because their abilities will grow in different directions. You have a lot more to go on than you do in, say, the basic and expert rulebooks for, well, either BX or BECME, or even the player's handbook for AD&D, in determining exactly what your thieves and assassins can do, and how much they can expect to make, and what the guilds are like, how much they can fence things for. That's all really cool detail. So, to me, the Palladium game is more immersive in certain areas, but that immersion comes at the cost of learning curve and speed of play. So you have to kind of ask yourself and your players what you want out of the game. I would run Palladium First Edition tomorrow if I had a group that were ready to play it. But for our nostalgia games, I find that basic D&D and AD&D come up a lot because everyone has internalized those systems to the point that you don't reference the rule books that often. Of course, that does result in a lot of poorly remembered rules and mixing additions inadvertently. I know I, for one, never played the initiative rules exactly as written. There is a PDF out there called ADDICT, ADDICT, that explains how first edition initiative was supposed to work. And most of the people that I've talked to did not use all the bells and whistles. I was actually rather impressed when I played an AD&D game last weekend at the convention with Grodog, Alan Grow, and initiative was rolled as it was rolled in AD&D, along with counting segments and spellcasting times, and we tended to lose spells because we would get attacked while casting. All of that, was complex but fun, which is how I describe Palladium Fantasy. It's complex but fun. And because it's not the universal D&D language that everyone seems to speak, you do look up rules a little more often. And you are referencing your character sheet because your strike bonus is different from your parry bonus, which is different from your dodge bonus. But in the end, you get some variety that was missing in early versions of D&D, where there weren't so many subclasses and weren't so many prestige classes in the 3.0 and 3.5 era. Fighters tended to be fighters and were differentiated by very few things, like which weapons you specialized in if you were using weapon proficiency rules. In Palladium, a lot of that variety is built into the game, and I'm here for it. So that is my summary of the Palladium Fantasy role-playing game. I see that we've been going way too long, but that's because this is a thick book. And a lot of the games we reviewed are little 64-page booklets. This is a 270-page plus book. And it's full of all sorts of different things. So yeah, sorry we went long on this one. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Next time, we're going to get back to Dungeons & Dragons. The first version of D&D we covered was BECME, because that's where I came on board. But now we're going to rewind to the chronological beginning of Dungeons & Dragons and take a look at 1974 OD&D. I hope to see you there. Remember, character is what you are in the dark. This has been the Old Dragoon. Good night.